This is Dr. Christy Webb in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'll often hear people say that they have PTSD from an event, perhaps an angry email that blasted them, or a movie that was really scary, or eating at a particularly bad restaurant. I think it's worth taking some time to delineate exactly what PTSD is and what it isn't. There are 5 requirements for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Not surprisingly, the first one is to have experienced a trauma. This is defined quite specifically in the field of psychology. We are traumatized when we are exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence ourselves, when we are an in-person witness, that is, the death, injury, or sexual violence is happening to someone else while we are present, if we learn that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend, or by experiencing repeated exposure to traumatic events, such as would be true, for example, of soldiers. Now, this doesn't include watching lots of TV, videos, or movies that include scenes of violence, or seeing photos of traumatic events such as the Boston Marathon bombing. But it might apply to a police officer, or even a psychotherapist who hears repeated stories of interpersonal violence. Now, most of us, after a traumatic event, don't have enduring effects. We're in a car accident, or we survive a sexual assault, or we're the victim of a mugging, and afterward, we're more careful. This is our brain's way of protecting us. The primitive part of our brain is telling us, watch out, be careful out there, on guard. Our body is tense, our heart races, our sleep may be disrupted, and we're awash in stress hormones. The brain is doing its job, which is to keep us alive and safe. But over time, as the trauma isn't repeated, we become less careful. The hyper-alertness diminishes, and eventually the trauma becomes just one of our stories. The brain has new memories to layer over the older, more painful ones. Each time we successfully drive home from work or go on a date and nothing traumatic happens to us, the brain adjusts and the body relaxes a bit more. This isn't true of folks with PTSD. Some people's brains never stand down. Their bodies never relax. So instead of filing the traumatic memory away in a mental filing cabinet, the brain leaves it out on the desktop. So every time the person who was in a car accident drives, or passes the accident site, or sees a car like the one in the accident, he or she once again tenses, gets ready to escape the trauma, is washed by stress hormones, is on edge and keyed up. The brain never recognizes that the danger has passed, that nothing bad is happening right now, and so the body responds as if there were great danger all the time. Now, in addition to experiencing a trauma, a second criterion for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is that thoughts or memories or dreams of the trauma intrude when you don't want them to. They're like a rude guest who won't leave your house. Flashbacks fall into this category. For example, if you're a female sexual assault survivor, you may have intense and distressing physical and emotional responses to your current partner's sexual advances, no matter how tender and loving they are. Or if you were in a car accident that left you pinned under the car for several hours, you may not be able to drive your car to work without having a panic attack. The third criterion for PTSD is called avoidance. We try to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings associated with the traumatic event. For example, we might try to avoid remembering what happened. More commonly, avoidance takes the form of refusing to return to the place where a trauma took place, or not talking about our service in the war. Now, this is made even more complicated by the stigma that mental illness has. Of course, you don't want to talk about what happened to you if you fear someone telling you you're crazy, or telling you just to buck up and get over it. It wasn't that big a deal and it's time to move on. The fourth criterion for PTSD is a change for the worse in thinking or mood following the trauma. We look for a couple of these symptoms. Sometimes survivors can't remember important details of the trauma, or they may have persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs such as no one can be trusted, or my nerves are completely shot forever, or I'm a bad person and can't be forgiven. They may feel fear, guilt, shame, and or horror all the time, feeling detached or estranged from other people, the inability to experience positive emotions, and decreased interest in activities. Those all sound like depression, don't they? Well, they are, and they can be part of the symptom picture of PTSD as well. Now, finally, the last symptom criterion is increased reactivity, such as irritability and angry outbursts, problems with concentration or sleep, an exaggerated startle response, that means jumpiness, and or reckless and self-destructive behavior. Now, in order to get the diagnosis of PTSD, a person must show symptoms from each of these 5 categories for more than 1 month. So, more than a month after the trauma, if you are still manifesting intrusive thoughts or dreams, persistent avoidance of reminders of the event, changes for the worse in mood and thinking, and increased reactivity, you probably have PTSD. Now, one hard thing about PTSD is that it is so often seen alongside other diagnoses. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and borderline personality disorder are the most commonly seen diagnoses that accompany PTSD. Dissociative identity disorder is another one. There are others as well. Psychologists don't entirely understand why some people are more vulnerable to PTSD than others are. How come some of those who were in Manhattan on 9/11 got PTSD and others never did? We know that there are some differences in the primitive part of the brain of people with PTSD, but we aren't sure whether that's because of the trauma or whether their brains were already different and that contributed to the PTSD. There are lots of treatments for PTSD that are supported by solid research. One is called prolonged exposure, or PE. Another is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. That's the one where you follow the finger of the therapist who's trained to do this type of therapy. There's a lot of exciting research going on these days using exercise, specifically running, to help PTSD sufferers increase a substance that helps the brain to repair itself and adapt to stress. Just talking about the trauma isn't enough, because doing so tends to bring up so many intense thoughts and feelings that unless the sufferer has solid skills in place to be able to manage the distress, things might get worse. Not every therapist works with trauma survivors. Those who do find the work hard and draining, but also rewarding. On my website, drchristywebb.com, I have a page called Resources, and it includes links to some excellent resources on PTSD research, diagnosis, and treatment. Thanks for watching.